and the Tower of London changed from the Prince of Wales's palace into his prison. He shared it with his brother. Neither was ever seen again. Did Richard have them killed? No one knows, but later the evidence was going to be shaped as far as possible to make him guilty. He's been said to have personally killed Henry VI and Henry's son, whose widow he married, and done the dirty deed with Clarence and the Malmsey, quite apart from the murder of the princes in the Tower. The picture of Richard that's come down to us, the hunchbacked, sinister and ruthless tyrant, is a caricature painted after he'd been deposed and immortalized by the Tudors' greatest propagandist, William Shakespeare. One of the buildings inside the Tower of London was even given the name the Bloody Tower to associate it with Richard's foul murder of the princes, though they almost certainly were in a different building anyway. He'd certainly been a popular figure in the north of England, where his brother had charged him with healing the divisions of the Wars of the Roses, but it only took 4 months for a rebellion to emerge against him. The rival candidate was, of course, the boy across the water, now not such a boy, Henry Tudor. The House of York was now as extinct as the House of Lancaster. Henry Tudor was all there was for disappointed Yorkists as well as Lancastrians. And there were plenty of disappointed Yorkists. Richard gave positions, power and wealth to men he trusted, whom he'd got to know in the north of England, leaving a lot of southerners out in the cold who thought they could do much better under a more sympathetic figure. And now he came. With a force of 2,000 refugees and French soldiers, Owen Tudor's grandson landed at Milford Haven in Wales on the 1st of August 1485. 3 weeks later, when he came to do battle at Bosworth, his force had grown by just 3,000 men. Richard came to the battlefield as rightful King of England. Before the battle began, he held a coronation ceremony, restating his right of true succession to the crown, a right which Henry Tudor did not possess at all. Actually, given the fact that his family was specifically barred from the succession, he had pretty much less claim than anyone else there. But that's not how things were working out. Richard III was the last English king to die on a battlefield. The crown of England was found lying under a bush at the end of the Battle of Bosworth and placed on Henry Tudor's head. And Henry understood how you rule England. Not by winning over great nobles, they'd pretty well all been wiped out, but by winning over public opinion. The pen is mightier than the sword, especially when it tells the story of what happened. Firstly, he must not be accused of killing a king, so Richard III was not king on the day of the Battle of Bosworth. Henry Tudor dated his reign from the day before the battle. It was Richard who'd been fighting against the king, not Henry. Henry was king. It was Richard who was the traitor. Got that? Secondly, he must deal with the question of his legitimacy as a ruler, so he married Edward IV's daughter. She was the legitimate line of descent from William the Conqueror, a true Plantagenet. Their son, when they had one, would be the legitimate heir by every possible standard. Well, so long as Edward IV's daughter was legitimate, so that had to be dealt with. All documents relating to the business of Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville being invalid were destroyed. All documents relating to the illegitimacy of their children were destroyed, including the Act of Parliament that had spelt out why Richard should be king. These orders were carried out so efficiently that only one copy of the Act has ever been found. That's how we know about it. Other evidence may have existed, destroyed even more efficiently. And if the children were not illegitimate, then of course Prince Edward had been the true King of England, and Richard was a regicide. What a villain! Assuming, of course, that Richard had been responsible for the boy's death. Well, he couldn't be alive, because if he were, he, and not Henry Tudor, would be the rightful king. There are some nasty people who suspect that if the princes in the Tower were still alive before the Battle of Bosworth, Henry would have disappeared them. Richard III became the Saddam Hussein of Tudor propaganda. Never mind the legitimacy of the war to destroy him, it did the world a favour. Of course, the consolidation of power was not only a matter of creating favourable propaganda. It also involved getting rid of a few people. Clarence, for example, the Malmsey drowner, had a young son, the Earl of Warwick, a nephew of both Edward IV and Richard III. He had been barred from the succession, but so had the man now on the throne, so there was no security in that. He went straight into prison in the Tower of London. But then a priest in Ireland suddenly produced a 10-year-old boy who he said was the rescued Earl. The boy looked right, spoke right, had all the right manners. He was solemnly crowned in Dublin Cathedral as Edward VI, and a force of Irish supporters backed by Flemish troops then landed in the north of England. They were supported by the Earl of Lincoln, John de la Pole, who was also a nephew of Edward IV and Richard III. He was their sister's son. In fact, Richard III, who had no children, had designated John as heir to the throne. John knew perfectly well that the child was an impostor, called Lambert Simnel, who had been carefully trained for the project. The rebels had obviously assumed that Henry had killed the Earl of Warwick, so wouldn't be able to prove that Simnel was an impostor. They were wrong. The prisoner, still alive, was put on public display, and the rebels were crushed. But never missing a trick, Henry forgave the child and gave him a job in the royal kitchen. He grew up to be a royal falconer. Another impostor appeared in 1492, this time claiming to be the younger of the princes in the Tower, Richard, Duke of York. His real name was Perkin Warbeck, and he stayed on the continent collecting support from anyone who fell out with Henry. Henry had persuaded Parliament to set up a special court to try members of the nobility who were a threat to the crown. A number of Warbeck's supporters suddenly found themselves arrested, tried for treason, and facing execution. This court was to become the notorious Court of the Star Chamber. Perkin was a constant irritant, first trying to invade from Ireland, then teaming up with the King of Scotland, and finally in 1497 he raised a rebellion in Cornwall, which Henry crushed, and promising leniency persuaded Perkin to surrender. Perkin was imprisoned in the Tower, which of course already housed Clarence's son, the Earl of Warwick. And of course it wasn't long before evidence appeared that the pair of them were plotting a joint escape, and that was the end of both of them. There was one other person with a claim to the throne, Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret. In fact, whatever claim he had, she must have a better one, but no woman had ever ruled England in her own right. And Henry needed a son to inherit the throne. His eldest was named Arthur. This child of the blood royal was to be linked not just to the Plantagenets, but to patriotic English legends. But Arthur died in 1502, leaving his younger brother Henry as the Tudor heir. And in 1509, when the 52-year-old king died, Henry VIII succeeded to the throne. He was the perfect king, a king out of the storybooks. He was 17 years old, extremely well educated, extremely good looking, with polished manners and the style and physique of an athlete. He also had an unchallengeable claim to the crown, and to secure the succession, Henry VIII married the woman to whom he'd been betrothed for 7 years, Catherine of Aragon, his dead brother's widow. The Spanish worried that this was against church rules, and so the Pope granted a dispensation. In fact, this was all rubbish. While the Bible specifically forbids a man from sleeping with his brother's wife, it actually insists that he must marry his brother's widow. Anyhow, 2 years later, Catherine gave birth to a son, but the infant soon died. So did the next. In fact, the marriage only produced one child that lived, a girl called Mary. Henry was effectively all-powerful. There were no great barons anymore in England, and his father had left a well-stocked treasury. Parliament consisted to a large extent of men who depended one way or another on royal favour, and the countryside was controlled by justices of the peace who served the government. You can see the change in the very nature of power from the home of Henry's Chancellor. 50 years earlier, Edward IV's Chancellor had been a Neville, the son of the Earl of Salisbury. In those days, an Englishman's home had been his castle. Middleton Castle, actually. It was his father's home, and that great lord had also been Chancellor. Independently powerful men, based in a mighty fortified palace. But under the Tudors, the great power of the Nevilles had been broken. Middleton Castle was in the hands of the king. When Henry VIII's Chancellor Wolsey built himself a home, it certainly wasn't a castle. It was this magnificent palace, Hampton Court. Glass windows instead of arrow slits, and chimneys instead of crenellations. No one needed a fortified house under the protection of a great king. And it was all at Henry's pleasure. If Wolsey didn't deliver what the king wanted, he was entirely dispensable. And that, of course, is what happened. The royal marriage was haunted by the ghost of their dead sons. By the end of the 1520s, Catherine was in her late 40s, had stopped getting pregnant, and there was still no male heir, just a daughter, and England had never been ruled by a woman. Henry, determined to have a male heir, must get rid of his wife. Then he would be free to take a younger bride and make a baby boy. The bride in question, Anne Boleyn, was already well installed in Henry's life. Henry, who'd already enjoyed her sister as his mistress, had wooed Anne with enthusiasm. He married her in 1533. Her coronation didn't seem to impress Londoners. Their entwined initials on the banners produced shouts of "Ha ha!" She was visibly pregnant and gave birth to a child. Drat! Another girl! She was named Elizabeth, and little Mary was declared illegitimate. The legality of this marriage must be sorted out before her next baby. That was Wolsey's job. He had to persuade the Pope that his predecessor should never have allowed the marriage to Catherine. Henry fancied himself as a theologian. He'd written an attack on Luther, which became a bestseller, and the Pope had declared him a defender of the faith. A proud boast which he stuck on the coinage and has remained there ever since. Every English monarch is fid deaf. So he told Wolsey exactly how the argument should be put to the Pope. Wolsey could probably have swung it if he'd been left alone. As it was, he failed and lost his job. And the Pope had also failed. So Henry, the defender of the faith, fired the Pope. To achieve this drastic act, having himself legally declared the supreme head of the Church in England, required an extraordinary shift in power. He had to find a way of giving the nation a voice so that it could say what he wanted. That way was through Parliament. The Church's wealth and power was hugely unpopular. The notion of no longer paying church taxes to Rome was really very cheery. But it wasn't as simple as that. Some people believed that the Pope really did represent divine authority. And for many others, there was a fear that the Pope might excommunicate their customers on the continent if they continued trading with them. With the effective help of a new chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, and a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, Parliament passed the necessary acts. By the end of 1534, the King of England had become, legally, the total, overall, supreme ruler of the whole shebang. Once Henry VIII had become head of the Church in England, he was a new kind of king. One immediate consequence of the new order was that he had control of the fabulous wealth of the English Church. It wasn't just the Pope who got the sack. He closed down all the monasteries and nunneries. There weren't all that many people in them, less than 10,000 over the whole country, but there may have been 10 times that number dependent on them. And in areas such as Lincolnshire and Northumberland, there was armed rebellion. One of the rebel leaders was John Neville from that great old family of barons. But the Nevilles were no threat to the modern crown. The rebellions were crushed. And monastic lands were sold off cheap to bolster the treasury, make Henry more popular, and allow successful businessmen to turn themselves into grateful country gentry who would loyally support the crown. The old struggle for power between the papacy and the monarchy had now been decisively settled. Becket, the 12th century archbishop whose defence of church power had led to his martyrdom, had been the most popular saint in England. Henry ordered Becket to be declared no saint, to be tried and convicted of treason, and for his bones to be burned and the dust scattered in the air. Who's in charge now, eh? What's more, in 1536 Catherine of Aragon died, meaning that the problem of the ex-queen had gone away. He and Anne Boleyn dressed in bright yellow to celebrate. But 4 months later, he was told that Anne had committed adultery. Henry was surrounded by courtiers jockeying for influence, forming alliances, factions, to do down those who might damage them, and Anne became a victim of an organized campaign by those who felt endangered by her faction. Whether it was true or not, no one knows, because Henry's fury was so total that her trial and those of her supposed lovers was a travesty. She might indeed get pregnant with a boy, but then its parentage would be in doubt, and she might not. She'd miscarried at least twice since Elizabeth's birth. Without a legitimate son, it had all been for nothing. Anne was imprisoned in the royal lodgings in the Tower of London. Henry had extended them before their coronation, and now she was occupying them for the first time. Not as his wife, but as his prisoner. After 18 days she was beheaded, and Henry married Jane Seymour. England after the death of Anne Boleyn was a kingdom like no other. Henry ruled in England as head of the church as well as king, like some pagan priest-king. He was the judge of heresy as well as crime. He held the keys to heaven as well as to earthly promotion. That chap in the Vatican was now just referred to as the Bishop of Rome. To even think the wrong thoughts in this kingdom could be treason. That was how the new Chancellor, Thomas More, found himself imprisoned in the bell tower of the Tower of London. Not for what he did, or even what he said, but for thinking that the king should not be head of the church. He was publicly executed on Tower Hill. Henry was terrifying, magnificent, generous, dangerous, and in most people's eyes the best king England had seen in a very long time. And Jane had a son, Edward. Sadly, she died in childbirth, but the throne was safe. His only problem was abroad, and by 1539 it did begin to look as though the Bishop of Rome might be lining up some muscle against him. But there were now well-established and powerful Protestant princes in Germany, and on the fine old principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend, Henry married into their world. He got Anne of Cleves for a wife. The defender of the faith, intellectual scourge of the Lutherans, had married one. Actually, neither of them was much interested in theology, or in each other. Henry, now fat, with an ulcerating leg and a vicious temper, thought his 23-year-old wife was plain smelly and lacking in all the graces. He called her a Flanders mare, and they both quickly agreed the marriage was a terrible mistake. Fortunately, it was soon discovered that she had a pre-contract of marriage with someone else, and so there never had been a valid marriage to Henry. The only casualty was Thomas Cromwell, who'd set the whole thing up, and who now went to the block. Well, him and one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. Her destruction began when More's ended. She was a kind of well-connected Monica Lewinsky figure, a teenager with sex on her mind who wanted to seduce the most powerful man around. And he fell for her and married her. And when she carried on being sexy and had sex with other men, he flew into another tempestuous rage and had her beheaded. Her lovers' heads were mounted on London Bridge. Henry then decided to marry John Neville's widow, Catherine Parr. She was extremely nervous, but had no choice. She worked hard at trying to keep Henry's temper in check, moderating his ferocity towards people he thought were traitors or heretics, and persuading him to acknowledge Mary and Elizabeth as his legitimate children. His death 4 years later in 1547 was obviously a huge relief. Henry had succeeded in leaving a son, but only just. Jane's son, Edward VI, 9 years old, was a sickly child. He was educated as a Renaissance prince, a humanist, and as a Protestant, far more so than his father. He was only a child, and government was in the hands of a council, but in a world of royal tyranny, this child wielded terrifying power. He was precocious, much too interested in theology, and not nearly interested enough in other people. He had a child's indifference to signing death warrants. He died in 1553 when he was 15, having declared his successor to be Lady Jane Grey. Who? Lady Jane Grey. King Edward's closest advisor was a chap called John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. He, like everyone else, knew that the next in line to the throne was Edward's older sister Mary, and Mary was a committed Roman Catholic, which meant that when she came to power, John Dudley would be in serious trouble. Well, dead, actually. So John had been talking things over with His Royal Little Highness, and they cooked up this bizarre proposal to hand the throne to John Dudley's daughter-in-law, the 15-year-old Jane Grey. She was Edward's first cousin once removed, not exactly next in line for the throne, but Protestant. The hereditary principle was a bit medieval, don't you think? Give that girl a crown. Jane knew absolutely nothing about what was being planned for her, and when she found out that she was to be queen, she fainted in shock. England had been swindled, and knew it. Jane came to London as queen, but was she? Everyone's eyes turned to Mary. Throughout all that had happened since Henry had disowned her, Mary had very publicly maintained her Catholic faith and the public celebration of the Mass. She'd become a symbol of resistance to tyranny, and whenever she appeared in public she was mobbed and jeered. And now Mary announced that she was the proper heir to the throne, and she was going from her home in Framlington in Surrey to be crowned in London. The journey was a procession through villages and towns filled with cheering crowds. She entered London to the greatest street party the city had ever seen. The dancing, drinking, and bell-ringing went on all night. After just 9 days as the first woman to rule England, Jane was placed under arrest by her own father, who was supposed to be her chief defender. She was imprisoned, and Mary felt obliged in the end to have Jane executed. It didn't help that her father joined a rebellion against Mary. But by then, 6 months after her triumph, many people were ready to rebel against Mary. The defiant woman who'd stood against tyranny was now on the tyrant's throne. The English didn't actually like the papacy, but Mary did. The English didn't like Spain, but Mary did. She married its king, Philip II. And the English didn't like being forced to subscribe to religious beliefs on pain of death. Mary had 277 people burned alive because of their religious opinions. Bloody Mary. Unable to have children, a bitter invalid, England's second queen died in 1558, 42 years old, the most detested ruler in all England's history. There were celebrations almost as fervent as had greeted her arrival 5 years before. Her sister Elizabeth came to sit in that terrible seat and be crowned by the grace of God Queen of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith and supreme head of the Church of England and Ireland, even though there was not a single yard of French soil actually ruled by England. Calais, England's last little piece of France, had been lost just before Mary's death. England had become an island, and its queen would have to be an island too. She couldn't marry because that would create a king who would be either a foreigner like Philip or an opportunist courtier who'd come trailing faction and enemies in his wake. she would be both queen and king, the virgin queen ruling from a tyrant's throne over a people whose support was essential. Monarchy in England was a paradox, and Elizabeth's solution to the paradox was wholly bizarre. The Tudor monarchy had been shaped by the need to create a line of valid, legitimate, male successors. That had not materialized, and now Elizabeth would choose to have no child at all. How would the crown survive? Elizabeth succeeded to the throne when she was 25 years old. By that age, women were generally married with children, but Elizabeth had never had any intention of doing that. Her father had killed her mother. His behavior towards his other wives had been equally dreadful. At 14, Elizabeth had announced that she would never marry. In fact, her survival through Mary's reign had depended on her being free of any association with anyone else. The slightest hint of her involvement with other people could have made her seem to be connected with plots against Mary, and would have led to her execution. She stayed mute, giving no sign of a religious, political, or emotional attachment that might destroy her. By the time she came to the throne, the persecutions of her predecessors had left it a stark and lonely place. 9 bishoprics were vacant, there was only 1 duke left alive, and the treasury was empty. She had no close relatives left alive. The heir to the throne was her aunt's granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, a Roman Catholic. No one knew whether Elizabeth was a Roman Catholic or a Protestant. The first test came over the oath of allegiance. Elizabeth insisted that, like her father, people must acknowledge her as head of the church. The bishops, Roman Catholics appointed by Mary, said that in that case none of them would allow her a coronation. Well, all except for the Bishop of Carlisle. He did the honours, and the popular acclamation for the new queen was terrific, and she shouted back, "God a mercy, good people." Elizabeth interpreted her religious role in a new way. She declared that she didn't mind whether her subjects were Catholic or Protestant, so long as they were loyal. She'd survived by being very careful about what she said and did, and that was how she coped with sovereignty. She dared not marry or be touched by scandal, but her every move was watched like any modern royal, maybe more so. To the extent that her laundresses were bribed by ambassadors who wanted to know whether her periods had stopped in case she was pregnant. She made herself look splendid, held magnificent pageants, and eventually seemed to be holding the kingdom together without the rebellions, persecutions, and massacres that had become regular features of English life. She managed this in partnership with an immensely loyal and capable minister, William Cecil, and constantly teasing the world with a showy flirtation with the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley. But the love affair she really encouraged was to have the nation adore her. In poetry, paintings, and theatre, she was Gloriana, the magical beauty to whom loyalty and love were equally due, and who had no lover or husband to distract her gaze. The main threat facing her was the possibility of a Catholic plot to replace her with one of the grandchildren of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, either Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, or Henry Stuart, the Earl of Darnley. Both of them had a valid claim, as not only was Elizabeth excommunicated, she was arguably illegitimate. They were carefully encouraged to maneuver themselves into helplessness. Mary was the more dangerous. She'd been Queen of France until her husband's death, and a ruler of Scotland who had French backing would be a danger to England even without the religious issue. But Mary's education had been unlike Elizabeth's. She'd not lived in fear of her life, but in the indulgent French court. This was not a good preparation for life in Britain, a land of conspiracies and killings. Darnley was a weak man in a weak position, a good-looking, unstable lout. What happened next looks like a cunning plan. Elizabeth pretty much obliged the 19-year-old Darnley to visit the 22-year-old widow Mary, having ordered him not to marry her. The result was totally predictable. And Darnley was a total liability to Mary. Dim-witted and resentful of his lack of power, he was also furiously jealous. and when he thought her adviser Rizzio was having an affair with Mary, he joined a plot that had Rizzio murdered in front of her. She now viewed Darnley, the patsy in all this, with hatred and contempt, and was herself complicit in the plot that murdered him with an explosion. She ended up fleeing her own kingdom and throwing herself on Elizabeth's mercy, ultimately a bad place to be. Elizabeth was half the time sure that Mary should be executed to deprive Catholic plotters of a candidate for the throne, and half the time sure that she should do no such thing. Ruling queens were rarer than hen's teeth. For one to kill another really wasn't good. She signed the death warrant, but in a state of real distress. Mary and Darnley had a son, James, and he was now the virtually incontrovertible heir to Elizabeth's throne. She wrote to him confirming that, and apologizing for what she'd done to his mother. The very idea that it was legitimate to kill a crowned sovereign was extremely dangerous. Elizabeth was deeply concerned with the rights and powers, the prerogatives of the sovereign. She was very wary of Parliament, which in her view treated every request for taxes as a blackmail opportunity to give itself powers of government. So she tried very hard not to ask for taxes, and her government was parsimonious, mean as possible, and then some. She was determined to protect royal authority. She refused to allow Parliament to refer to England as a state. She said it sounded too much like something to do with the States General, the parliamentary body that ruled the Dutch Republic. That republic, born out of a rebellion against the King of Spain, was in Elizabeth's eyes an unfortunate novelty. It was her ally in her struggle to keep England out of Spain's clutches, but she was nervous that its political ideas might be catching. England was a kingdom. It happened to be ruled by a queen, but as she famously said, one who had the heart and stomach of a king. Of course, Elizabeth's greatest moment was when she managed to see off the Spanish Armada, when Philip II, by far the most powerful ruler in the world, assembled a vast fleet to collect an invasion army from the Low Countries and bring England back into the Roman Catholic Church. The English fleet, genuinely patriotic, genuinely daring, skillfully harried the Armada to prevent it finding a safe anchorage where it could make contact with the landing force. When the Spanish decided to sail home, they were hit by strong winds and heavy seas that were too much for many of these Mediterranean cargo vessels. So far as the English and the Dutch were concerned, God had blown them away. Philip himself saw it as a baffling defeat that meant God was not on his side. But Elizabeth was still not prepared to ask Parliament for the money to pay her victorious sailors' wages. They were not due to be paid until they came ashore, so their queen left them rotting at anchor. And when messengers came to court to plead for the starving men who'd saved England, they arrived in the middle of extravagant celebrations of the victory and were turned away. Elizabeth died, the grandest of all England's rulers, in 1603. Her successor was Mary's son, James Stuart, already ruler of Scotland. He had inherited glory, but with it an empty treasury and an isolated kingdom. In the next programme, we'll see what the Stuarts did with this poisoned chalice.
On to the Stuarts tonight at 10, and to test your knowledge of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Sky Digital viewers press red. Coming up on UK TV history, decisive weapons at Agincourt and in the Falklands, the longbow and the Harrier jet.
The story of the kings and queens of England is more surprising than you might think. It's a fine drama, 1,000 years of tales of lust and betrayal, of heroism and cruelty, of mysteries, murders, tragedies, and triumphs. The story of the Stuarts is, when you think about it, the most surprising of all. It's the story of a country deciding that it should abolish the monarchy and become a republic, and then, without any outside force or pressure, overthrowing the republic and making itself a monarchy again. That never happened anywhere else. Why did it happen here? James became King of Scotland when his mother Mary fled to England in 1567. He was 1 year old when he was crowned James VI. He grew up learning how to steer a path between religious fanatics and the violent Scottish nobility, and at the same time acquired a serious scholarly education. He was very proud of that. He pleaded for his mother's life, but accepted the fact of her execution by the English Queen Elizabeth. Business was business, and he had no memory of Mary. He'd been taught that she was a scarlet woman, and she had, after all, murdered his father and taken a lover. He was the recognized heir to the English crown, and he wasn't going to put that in danger. And so, in 1603, when Elizabeth the Virgin Queen eventually died, the oldest monarch England had ever had, he came from Edinburgh to London for his coronation. He was openly bisexual. The word in London was that Elizabeth had been a king, and now they had James the Queen. In Latin, of course. By the accident of heredity, England and Scotland were now united in a single kingdom, Britain. Everyone had high hopes of James, especially the Roman Catholics, who thought that his distaste for bossy Scottish Presbyterians would encourage him to lift Elizabeth's restraints on their worship. They were wrong about that. So a group of well-connected Roman Catholic terrorists planned to blow up the entire political structure at the opening of Parliament in 1605. They brought over an explosives expert from the Low Countries. He organised placing 2.5 tons of gunpowder in a cellar under the Palace of Westminster. It's a sign of how secure England became that for the last 200 years, November the 5th, the anniversary of Guy Fawkes' capture, has been simply an excuse for a fun night of pretty explosions. Today, of course, in the shadow of 9/11, 5/11 has a more chilling resonance. Al-Qaeda terrorism has tainted many people's idea of Muslims, which perhaps makes it easier to understand how Fawkes' terrorism affected people's idea of Roman Catholics. Actually, James himself was more sympathetic to high church than to low, because the followers of Protestant sects did not want priests and bishops to do religion on their behalf. In the Protestant view, the godly man has his own Bible, the devil's agent is a priest with a Catholic prayer book. James felt that people who didn't have respect for hierarchy in church would be equally disrespectful of authority in general. No bishop, no king was his fear. And the authority of the king was very dear to him. He spelled out his ideology in masks, theatrical balls, in his new banqueting house in Whitehall. His intellectual take on the job was that he was God's deputy, and that he ruled by divine right as the absolute sovereign power in England. Having been raised in Scotland, he was rather baffled by the idea of common law, the notion that law was in the hearts and minds of the people, expressed through the precedents of the courts and their juries of ordinary folk. But this was the essence of the English system. It had been essential for the Normans to operate that way, as foreign rulers in a land they didn't know, and it had become embedded in the fabric of English life. Henry VIII and Elizabeth had the position of tyrants, but their tyranny required popular consent. They had to be popular in order to rule. James wasn't good at being popular. He was head of a court, a place of factions and favourites, and was grand in a very private way. One example of his sense of power and duty was in his treatment of tobacco. It had been introduced from America by Walter Raleigh, and Elizabeth had felt rather alarmed by it. It made her feel ill. She bet Raleigh that he couldn't weigh the smoke that came out of a pipe. Raleigh knew how to perform. He weighed an ounce of tobacco, smoked it, weighed the ash, and the missing weight was the smoke. Elizabeth laughed and paid up, saying she'd seen men turn their gold into smoke, but this was the first time she'd seen smoke turn to gold. James's whole approach was different. He disliked smoking and felt it was his duty to protect his subjects. But he was a rational man, a teacher, so he wrote a pamphlet, Counterblast to Tobacco, explaining that it was
loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black, stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless.
He wanted to persuade people by the force of his argument, so he published it anonymously. Of course, no one took any notice. So, as the wise and kindly father of his people, he banned the growing of tobacco in England and increased the customs duty on tobacco by 4,100%. And reissued the pamphlet with his name on it. His whole approach was based on rational thought, not an English habit, and what he saw as the absolute authority of a king, also rather foreign to them. And his authority was not backed by any army, and his income was too small to run both the court and the government. The regular royal income came from rents on lands, feudal dues, and customs duties. But the flood of gold and silver coming to Europe from the New World had created inflation, reducing the real value of that income. Medieval government was designed for rather static farming economies and vast estates. Towns, run by common folk with special liberties granted in charters, had been useful little add-ons. But now international and intercontinental trade had blossomed. The nobles had declined, the towns had become major financial centres. Inflation, the growth of Protestantism, a lack of respect for traditional authority, the emergence of assertive members of Parliament, none of this was restricted to England. But in England it had a slightly different flavour. Everywhere else the ruler made the law, he was the law, but not in England. Kingship existed under the law. James simply didn't understand this. He was certain that the job of king meant being above the law, and being James, he not only understood this was the problem, but said so as a matter of principle. And when the Lord Chief Justice disagreed, the Lord Chief Justice got the sack. James was, people said, the wisest fool in Christendom. He needed to raise taxes, but taxation was always regarded as a special event. Taxes might be levied if there was an emergency need for cash, but the law said that this could not be done without the agreement of Parliament, which gave the Commons the chance to present demands to him. They expected what was called redress of grievances before granting him supplies, and these were exactly the kind of people who tended to be Puritans, low church, with no real sense of proper deference to people better born than themselves. So he avoided that as much as possible. His way of life didn't help either. His diversions were hunting, an obsession, and pretty young men, another obsession. Right at the start of his reign, he took up with a pretty young Scot who'd been his page. Robert Carr was given the estate of the executed Walter Raleigh, and quickly became a viscount and a privy councillor. When Carr decided to wed the married 17-year-old Countess of Essex, who hated her husband, James helped to sort out the divorce. The Countess's family, the Howards, detested Carr, but realised this was the best way to get into favour at court. Carr's close friend, Sir Thomas Overbury, tried to warn him off that filthy, base woman, which annoyed the Countess.
So the sweet young couple poisoned Sir Thomas, which opened the door eventually to the Howard's enemies, who exposed the murder plot to James, while providing him with another very beautiful young man, George Villiers, to take Carr's place.
Carr and his wife were sentenced to death, and Villiers, whose legs were wonderful, became the Duke of Buckingham, and the murderous couple were pardoned.
James wasn't exactly a Puritan's role model. By the time King James died, aged 58, in 1625, the King and the Puritans were set on course for a direct collision, and his son Charles wasn't going to change direction. The new king was 25 years old, gauche with a nervous stammer, but deeply conscious of his place as God's anointed ruler of Britain, the new father figure, and he played the part of absolute ruler as well as he possibly could.
Of course, it was not the part that the Puritan merchants and gentry wanted played. They refused to grant taxes without being allowed a role in government, so Charles tried to manage on the sources of revenue that didn't need parliamentary approval. The most celebrated example was when he levied ship money. An ancient law was unearthed obliging seaports to provide ships in times of war. True, there was no war, but there were pirates, weren't there? In 1634, Charles made his demand and told the ports they could pay cash instead, ship money. This engraving was published to make people proud of paying up. And then the next year he extended the demand to inland communities. Otherwise, it would be unfair. It was obvious that if he got away with this, he'd have reinvented taxation under another name and would never need Parliament at all. The entire nation had steam coming out of its ears. One wealthy Buckinghamshire man, John Hampden MP, refused to pay and was hauled into the Court of Exchequer. Hundreds of people tried to jam into the court to watch. Of the 12 judges, 7 found for the king and 5 for Hampden. Since the king had thought he controlled the judiciary, this was a moral victory for Hampden. Things were made worse by Charles's actions as head of the church. He regarded Puritanism as fundamentally seditious, which made many people think he was really a closet Roman Catholic. He wasn't, but he was determined to impose a uniform system of worship which was decidedly high church. And that simply added to the anger of a growing Puritan class. And in Scotland, it was met by direct rebellion. Without the money to hire reliable troops, and with popular hostility in London making life positively dangerous, Charles had to accept restrictions on his power which were to him intolerable. In 1641 he agreed Acts of Parliament which took many powers from him, including the right to dissolve Parliament and the right to raise customs duties without its consent. In January 1642, in a state of confused desperation, he tried to arrest 5 members of the Commons by actually turning up there with armed guards. He failed, and faced with violent anger in the streets, he fled from London. In November, the now inevitable civil war began. People were called upon to choose between their king's determination to break the pretensions of Parliament and Parliament's determination to limit the power of the king. Most people actually didn't think they wanted to get involved, but the war grew with a murderous logic of its own and gradually became more bitter and more inescapable. It's now reckoned that possibly 250,000 people died in battle, of starvation, of disease, as a result of the fighting, out of a population of about 5 million. That's a far higher death rate than in the First World War. When the war ended in 1646 with the defeat of Charles's forces, an attempt was made to negotiate a settlement, but Charles was a dishonest negotiator, simply using this opportunity to try and organize the conquest of England from Ireland and Scotland. And then something quite new happened. In the brief and decisive Second War, the parliamentary army developed a revolutionary will of its own. When Charles was recaptured in 1647, Parliament tried to disband its forces, but General Fairfax and his men proclaimed that they were not a mere mercenary army and flatly refused to go home. Their job wasn't finished. The revolution had to be completed. They said it had to be established that the House of Commons was the supreme authority of England, and the king was,
but at the most, the chief public officer of this kingdom, and accountable to this house.
That was in September 1648. The Commons said, "Don't be so silly."
You are exceedingly deceived, for God gives the king his authority.
The army wasn't happy with that, so it crushed Parliament. It occupied London, used St. Paul's as the cavalry stables, and looted the treasury. 45 MPs were arrested, 146 were barred. The rump that remained were in effect the members chosen by the army, who would do what it wanted, which was to put Charles on trial for treason, for levying war against the Parliament and Kingdom of England. The rump parliament, as people called it, resolved that they could make laws without the consent of the king or of the House of Lords, and then passed a law setting up a court to try the king. Charles said that he didn't recognize the court, as someone needed to explain to him what authority it possessed. On the 27th of January 1649, this court condemned him to death. Charles was taken to the banqueting house, that theatrical set built by his father for dramatic presentations in which the scripts were all about the glory of royal power. It was no longer used for those masks. Charles had commissioned Rubens to make paintings for the ceilings, and they were too precious to be damaged by candle smoke. The ideology of the performances had now been put on permanent display by Rubens. The paintings celebrated James's absolute rule, casting out war and discord, bringing peace, harmony, order, and prosperity to a grateful people. Charles, the small, dignified, stuttering man who'd commissioned the work and presided over the reality that flowed from it, was marched out through a window onto a specially constructed platform. He wore a thick vest so that he would not shiver with cold, which might be mistaken for terror. And on that stage he knelt with calm dignity, and his head was cut off. Britain no longer had a king.